Welcome to Love and Leadership, the podcast that helps you lead with both your head and your heart, plus a bit of humor. I'm Kristen Sharkey, a leadership coach and facilitator.
And I'm Mike Sharkey, a senior living and hospitality executive. We're a couple of leadership nerds who also happen to be a couple.
Join us each week as we share our unfiltered opinions, break down influential books, and interview inspiring guests.
Whether you're a seasoned executive or a rising star, we're here to help you level up your leadership game and amplify your impact.
Hello, and welcome back to Love and Leadership. I'm Kristen.
And I'm Mike.
And today we are doing an LBC episode.
LBC.
And we are also going to have a Love and Leadership first, where this is actually our first book / episode that we are breaking into two parts because the book we're doing today is Dare to Lead, Brave Work, Tough Conversations, Whole Hearts by the one and only Brené Brown. And it's funny, this book doesn't seem that long. I think it's only like 270 pages of actual content, but there is so much packed into here. I mean, I think it's really a combination of two or three of her books applied to leadership that as soon as we started going through it, we're like, yep, this is a two-parter. So we will cover the first half or so today, and then we'll be back in a couple weeks with part two.
This is the first leadership book that I read written by a woman. I have obviously a predilection for military history books and military leadership. And
yeah, there's not
all those are dudes.
A lot of women writing those.
Not a lot of women. There probably are now. There's some pretty well-known generals.
I mean, I would say the genre of business books in general is very dominated by male authors as well.
So I mean, reading this was, I would say, pretty life-changing just to hear a completely different viewpoint. And men and women don't see everything the same. Fascinating. Okay, what can we learn here? So amazing book, and we're going to get into it.
Yeah. Just to give some background before we jump into the book itself. So Brené Brown, I'm guessing there is a very good chance you've heard of her. She's probably the most famous, definitely the most famous author I think we've covered so far and probably will cover for a while. But she is a researcher at the University of Houston, Graduate College of Social Work, and her work there has centered on courage, vulnerability, shame, empathy, and leadership. And she really came to fame with her 2010 TED Talk, which was called The Power of Vulnerability, which is one of the top 5 most viewed TED Talks of all time. She's the author of 6 #1 New York Times
only 6
bestsellers.
Come on. 10 or it's not impressive.
Oh my God. 6 New York Times #1 bestsellers. It's crazy. It's like an author's dream.
Sure. Well, she's clearly she's an amazing researcher. Her methodology is very solid, but she's filling a real vacuum of need and want in the genre, in the industry, in society, of talking about the things that nobody else wants to talk about and doing it very openly. And, later on, she says courage is one of her main values, and she's pretty vulnerable with the things she talks about.
She is, yeah. Dare to Lead was published in 2018, and it really takes the concepts that were primarily presented in her books, Daring Greatly, which is all about like vulnerability and shame, and Rising Strong, which is about resilience, and applies them to the workplace. And she also has some concepts from her first book, The Gifts of Imperfection, as well. So it's really like this masterpiece of pulling in these concepts from her work and like all of these different things and applying it to leadership, which is why I think there's so much meat in here.
Yeah, this is the first book of hers that I read. And then I went back and read all the other books. And I was like, oh, okay, this is her compendium of, decades of research. And
yeah. And it's funny, I'm a big fan of hers. I had read her earlier books and listened to podcasts and so forth, but I had never actually read this book. So it was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it was really good.
This is my second reading. It's really super amazing.
So kind of jumping into the introduction of the book, I think it's really worth knowing. She talks about all the research that informs this book comes from 400,000 pieces of data. She is a researcher first and foremost.
Yeah, she's a hardcore researcher.
Yeah, so I think that really speaks to this. She's not just saying things, like they're very based in research and evidence. And then
Can we welcome our first podcast
Beezus
guest to
here.
The show today. Hi, Beezus. Hi, baby.
Yep. It wouldn't be a Love and Leadership episode if it didn't have at least
so pretty
one Beezus appearance.
There'll be many.
I'm sure she'll be back. Anytime we're podcasting, she's like, oh, this is a great time to come up and get attention.
You're so pretty.
Mike is very distracted.
I'm distracted
by her beauty.
She's so pretty.
So I'll talk. So she defines a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and who has the courage to develop that potential. And this book really came out of interviews that indicated that we need braver leaders and more courageous cultures as a whole. So she says there's basically these 3 truths to daring leadership and what she means by that. The first one is you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability, also known as embrace the suck, which I like. So start saying that regularly, embrace the suck.
Yeah, and this is an amazing concept.
But yeah, so I think it's worth spending a moment defining the word rumble because she uses it a lot in this, like all the way through the book, right? So she defines it in this context as a discussion, conversation, or meeting defined by the commitment to lean into the vulnerability, to stay curious and generous, to stick with the messy middle of problem identification and solving, to take a break and circle back when necessary, to be fearless in owning our parts, and to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard.
Yeah, when I hear rumble, of course, I'm going right to West Side Story.
I did not even think of that.
Ba-da-dum. Ba-da-dum.
Maybe. But yeah, I will say like rumble is not my favorite word for this.
No,
I don't really have a great alternative either, but it's Brené's world in this book.
It is, and I understand like what she's talking about. Like what's going on in your stomach during this happening is a bit of a rumble. Yeah. It's an emotional churning, rumbling in there.
Well, she makes a lot of references to like going into the arena when you're having.
That's where she got so that quote is from Teddy Roosevelt. And it's worth saying, right? And a lot of people say this nowadays. So it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. So, yeah.
Which is a great quote.
It's so good.
Yeah. And she says our ability to be daring leaders will never be greater than our capacity for vulnerability.
Oh, it's so good.
It's so good.
It's so good.
Yeah. So like rumbling in the context of this book is really the hard discussion, being willing to get into the difficult stuff, being vulnerable, being curious, listening. Like that is really like the heart of this. And it's hard. But the second truth of this is self-awareness and self-love matter. Is who we are is how we lead. And courage is less about who we are and more about how we behave and show up in difficult situations, which is so true. I think that's one of the things I heard several years ago is courage is not an absence of fear.
Yeah, it's a behavior in the face of fear.
Yeah.
The book circles back and forth between these topics, but she has a very poignant anecdote where she's given a lot of talks to the military members, military leaders, and she's talking to some what seems like very battle-hardened soldiers. And she asked them something like, how many of you have either carried out or seen an act of courage? And of course, everybody raises their hand. And then says something like, how many of you have felt vulnerable or something? And no one raises their hand and of course, no one wants to admit vulnerability. And then she circles back and says, how many of you have seen an act of courage that wasn't also accompanied by a moment or moments of extraordinary vulnerability? So when you put it like that, yeah, in order to have courage, you have to be in moments of vulnerability. So it's a behavior in the face of uncertainty.
Yep. And then her third truth is that courage is contagious, and you can truly build a culture out of it, which I think is absolutely true. And she talks about if you're truly a daring leader, you need to care for and be connected to the people that you lead, which I think is a really important point, right?
This whole book is about connection. Her raison d'etre is connection.
Yeah, for sure. But I think this is also the way she frames this, because I think we've all managed people we didn't necessarily get along with super well or had a harder time relating to and things like that. And she says, as a leader, if we do not have the sense of caring towards somebody we lead, you have two choices. You can either develop the caring and the connection within yourself or find a leader who's a better fit. And I think that's a really meaningful thing to say. If you have somebody on your team who frustrates you, and you may or may not have the ability to put them somewhere else or find a better fit for them or whatever, right? But if you're in a situation where like they're going to be on your team, sometimes if you really get down to the vulnerability to these conversations and you approach it with curiosity, you can completely change your perception of them. And you have a responsibility as a leader to care for and connect with your people. That doesn't mean they always need to like you, but you need to at least care about their well-being and their best interests.
Yeah, we'll talk about later, like empathy. The first thing is perspective taking. So even if you don't get along with your team or your own leader, like you can try and take their perspective. It will soften the situation for sure.
For sure. And then she says courage is a collection of 4 skill sets that can be taught, observed, and measured. That's another important thing with this, is that this is all stuff that can be developed. But these are also the 4 parts of the book, right? Rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, braving trust, and learning to rise. And I love the way that she ends the introduction is this quote: if you want to call these soft skills after you've tried putting them into practice, go for it. I dare you.
Yeah, I wrote this down too. And I thought of the strong reaction you had the other week. And I was like, okay, I totally agree with that. That's absolutely true.
Yeah. And I can't remember which episode that was off the top of my head. But yeah, I was on a rant about how I hate the phrase soft skills being used because it implies that they're less important. And yeah, I love this quote.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of straight up courage to have really difficult conversations with people, and knowing that they may be uncomfortable, they may be hurt, they may lose a job, they may not see themselves clearly. And that's the connection part, right? Like, it's hard. Those are very hard skills as opposed to the technical skills. I think we can call them human skills.
Yeah, I like human skills.
Yeah, human skills. And this is real courageous stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not stuff that we are taught. Maybe the generation that is children now can be taught more of this stuff because
they're being taught like regulation skills and
yeah,
that's the real warrior stuff right there.
Right.
Yeah. When I read this part, I was like, this woman's a warrior. Like, you don't have to wear a patch on your arm and carry a weapon to be a warrior. This is warrior stuff right there. I wrote down a quote from Dune, so I'll quote the Lisan al-Gaib, right? Long live the fighters.
I love it. So that kind of wraps the introduction of the book. So moving into part 1, which is rumbling into vulnerability, which this is broken into like 5 sections and is actually over half the book. So I will be surprised if we actually get all the way through this in our first episode, because there's so much in here.
One of us likes to go off on tangents also.
Yeah. Not only one of us. One of us has a greater tendency. I love you.
I make a lot of connections.
You do, yeah.
There's a lot of connections. Yeah. And I will try and refrain from bringing Jocko into this too much, but there's a lot of parallels, and it's just so fascinating to hear from a different perspective, from a woman's perspective. And there's a reason we need to hear women's voices in this space and in our lives.
I think that's like the more episodes we do of this podcast, I think it's clearer and clearer. All the stuff we're talking about is connected, but it's so valuable to get different perspectives on it. And I think feeds into like our mission as a podcast, right?
And the thing I got on this reading was courage is actually a teachable skill.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our raison d'etre of the podcast, is like leadership can be learned. Well, you can learn these skills. They're teachable and repeatable and practicable, if that's a word.
Yeah. So moving into section 1, which is about the myths surrounding vulnerability. And she starts out by saying, if we're brave enough, often enough, we will fall. Daring is not saying I'm willing to risk a failure. It's saying I know I'll eventually fail and I'm still all in. Yes. So for high achiever personalities, this is hard. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is like the center of my work, right? With bringing in aspects of improv and learning how to fail. So I deeply feel this.
I thought of Olympic lifting again too, where the first thing you learn is how to ditch the bar on a missed lift, and you'd practice that for a while. In judo, you practice how to fall for like, I don't know, I've never learned judo, but probably you should for the first 6 months. All they teach you is how to fall.
Yeah. Yep.
Skill. That's a skill.
It is.
I'm
absolutely
not good at that.
Oh, it's so hard.
I'm so hard at that.
But you know what? I'm better at it than I used to be. And
that's some self love right there. That's
I think
good.
You are also.
Yeah.
Like that's, we're all works in progress. This stuff is hard for everybody. Nobody.
She recommended a book that I'm going to pick up, Kristen Neff, who's a self-compassion researcher. I'm like, that sounds interesting. I need some of that for breakfast. And the book is called Self-Compassion. I'm like, okay, I'm going to look at that.
Seems valuable. So she defines vulnerability as the emotion we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And says that vulnerability isn't...
I knew you'd see that. So my amazing note-taking wife, she could probably read this book in an hour if she really just powered through it. An hour, like she's such a fast reader and she types just as fast. And if she had vulnerability equals the emotion we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And we're working off a shared document, and I backspaced and corrected it to risk in front of her eyes.
Did it matter? We'd already said it.
No, but I know.
Perfectionism, it really fits in.
You never know when we might need these notes again. Like,
right, yeah.
Maybe Brené will want to have us on her. Does she have a show?
She does have a podcast. Yeah.
She's so good.
Sorry,
I have such a
that really cracked me up as an perfectionism and failure.
I thought you would like
that. But vulnerability isn't winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome.
It's so the way she's broken these concepts down and elucidated them. Sorry, I have such a leadership crush on her now.
I know. Yeah, me too. I also relate a lot to her, which we'll get into some of these other parts. But I love that she says, if you are not in the arena getting your ass kicked on occasion, she's not interested in or open to your feedback. So many people will never be brave with their own lives, but will spend all their energy hurling advice and judgment at those who do dare greatly, which is so true. So it's if you're thinking about whose opinion matters to you, because so many people will have feedback and opinions and criticism of you, but so often they're criticizing you because they're not willing to take those same risks themselves. And it's a lot easier to give feedback from that place.
Yeah, we see that a lot, especially keyboard warriors now, right? Like, yeah, we see that like in MMA. All these guys are like, you shouldn't have tapped. Oh my God. Like, you're sitting on your couch eating Cheetos. How are you commenting on some dude like in a UFC fight? Like,
yep. So then she says it's important to get clear on whose opinions matter to you and seeking feedback from those people, like even when it's hard to hear. So I love this concept of a square squad, where she says, take a 1x1 inch square piece of paper and then write down the names of the people whose opinions of you matter. Which is, it's specifically constrained so that you
1
can't
inch by 1 inch is tiny.
You can't fit too many people on it. So it really forces you to think about whose opinion do you actually care about. And I love this. 10 minutes.
The square squad.
The square squad,
Square squad.
Yeah.
Square squad.
I heard Mike call one of his directs, or said that she was on his square squad the other day.
And she was like, what is that? I was like, read the book. Which she will.
Yeah. And then she says, take 10 minutes to reach out to those people and share a little gratitude, which is always a good reminder, right? But like, these people should be people who love you, not despite your vulnerability and imperfections, but because of them.
I don't think I love myself because of my vulnerabilities and imperfections. I mean, that's the real work, right?
Well, and like, she talks about empathy. She also talks about self-compassion.
Yeah.
When we get deeper into this, right? It's like
she talks about like talk to yourself the way you would talk to someone you love. And she gives a lot of examples of how she doesn't do this. Mm-hmm. And she makes a mistake on a 2-hour long form podcast where she uses some vulgarity. And I do heart this. She's from Texas. They cuss. They're very direct. And she lets fly, and then she beats herself up over it. She's so stupid. How could you do that? And then she wouldn't talk to anybody else like that. Why am I talking to myself like that?
Yep.
But
I use this as a tool in like coaching and facilitation a lot, actually. Like the other week when I was facilitating a workshop, one of the ways I have people introduce themselves is with 3 adjectives that a friend would use to describe you. And I use it in coaching too. It's like, what would you say if a friend came to you with this issue? Because we're so much better at thinking about how we would talk to somebody we love versus how we talk to ourselves, which is not usually like somebody that we love. So, yeah.
You're an idiot. How could you do that?
Yeah.
What's wrong with you?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. But she then gets into these 6 myths of vulnerability and debunking them. And the first one is that vulnerability is a weakness, which she says that to feel emotions is to be vulnerable, because vulnerability is at the core of all emotions. So if you believe that vulnerability is a weakness, then you believe that feeling is a weakness, which like...
It is.
Granted, I have had a lot of problems with feeling my feelings and such, but so I do get this, but it's really true. And this is where she was talking about that story where she was talking to a group of soldiers and had them realize that every act of courage.
To bring Jocko back into this, one of the things he said he does with his soldiers, and then he did when he was training fighters, is he prepares them for what they're going to actually feel. Hey, sir, you're going to feel terribly afraid. You're going to feel fear in the way that you have never felt before. And he starts to normalize that for them. And he's not only that, here's what's going to happen to your body when you feel that. And here's how to deal with it. So if Jocko can admit that you feel like, we can all step up and say, okay, I'm often afraid. And she breaks down a lot of our behaviors. And at the root of them are a lot of different fears of fear of loss of connection, fear of loss of job, fear of loss of livelihood. And we're about to air in the middle of these 2 episodes, an interview with Megan Romano, who is a very accomplished psychotherapist. Is that the right way to? She's a therapist.
She's a therapist. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist.
But she says the main fear is like losing people. So many of our behaviors are subconsciously rooted around trying to keep people in our lives.
Yep. And then the next myth is I don't do vulnerability, but like where she says our daily lives are defined by experiences of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. You can do vulnerability or it can do you. And pretending you don't do it means letting fear drive our thinking and behavior without our input or even awareness.
I do love Texas women. They are very direct. They're no nonsense.
I love it.
They don't have time for your hoopla or your hootenanny or anything. They are very direct and strong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And then number 3 is I can go it alone. But she talks about the fact that human beings are hardwired for connection, like our neural, hormonal, and genetic makeup support interdependence over independence. And this was written in 2018, so it was before the pandemic. But I think that going through the pandemic proved that pretty thoroughly in a way we didn't fully understand before that. So
I think the interesting thing here is the hormonal makeup too. Like your body rewards you for connection with other people, be it mental or physical. I've seen marriage counselors say, do a 20-second hug. Why 20 seconds? Because the body starts to release, it's probably dopamine, certain chemicals when you are in physical contact with your partner long enough. So we're literally rewarded for that.
Yeah.
And one of the stress responses you can respond to stress is the tend and befriend response. And so your body will reward you when you're under stress if you go and seek out connection and find your tribe, so to speak. It will give you a reward, a chemical reward for that.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is cool. Neurobiology, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is cool. Number 4 is you can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability, which you cannot. But I thought it was actually interesting. She says the people who have the hardest time grasping this are people like engineers where the vulnerability is used like in the context of a systemic vulnerability, which is really like a weakness or a place.
Yeah, that's mechanical.
Yeah. So a lot of times they have a really hard time separating systemic vulnerability from emotional vulnerability.
Well, I thought her anecdote was cool. She was giving a presentation to a group of engineers, and one of the engineers said something like that, like, I don't do vulnerability, or I don't understand that. My whole job is like engineering that out of systems. And she said, have you had, and I'm probably not quoting it correctly, but something where she's, have you had any difficult like conversations with colleagues? And he said, yeah, I have a direct report who's just not getting it. And he's not getting it. And I've had to coach and counsel him. And I think I might have to let him go or something. And she goes, how does that feel? And he's okay, I'm going to sit down now. So like that's the parts of our job that involve other humans, not just our technical work.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't talk about that. It's just like a whole current of our existence that we don't feel comfortable discussing.
Yeah. And then the last 2 of the myths I think are both really interesting. The 5th is that trust comes before vulnerability. So it's like you can only open up and be vulnerable with somebody when you trust them. And she tells a story about she was doing an exercise with Post-it notes with groups where they complete the sentence, I grew up believing that vulnerability is. And then they share at the same time what was on their Post-it note. And one person answered the first step to betrayal.
Jeez, that's aggressive.
Like, ooh, yeah. But she said we need trust to be vulnerable, and we need to be vulnerable in order to build trust. So it's actually really this chicken and the egg thing where they both help build each other. And trust is actually like the stacking and layering of these small moments and reciprocal vulnerability over time. So trust and vulnerability grow together. But if you betray one of them, you destroy both.
So let's do this now. What did you grow up believing vulnerability was?
Ooh.
I grew up believing vulnerability is weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think I did as well. I think the generation of our parents, like our parents are around the same age, right? Like boomers.
Yeah, they're boomers.
Yeah, I just don't, there was not a lot of understanding of this in that generation. And I think it was generally, vulnerability is weakness is the messaging that they passed down.
In my family, feelings other than anger were not really allowed or normalized.
Yeah, in my family, it was more like the negative feelings were more avoided but there's a lot of like love and positivity. So I think it can show up in different ways, but this was not something that our parents were educated on.
Well, and how can we blame them for that? We have the internet. We have tens of thousands of leadership books, parenting books. Our parents had one book by Dr. Spock. That was it. They couldn't, the resources also weren't there.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a generational thing, not an individual thing. But for sure, I grew up believing don't show your feelings. Any vulnerability is weakness. If you show that, somebody's going to exploit it. The first step to betrayal.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, you're going to have a hard time connecting with anyone for the rest of your life if you grow up like that. Sure.
Yep.
So
that's true. And then the sixth myth is that vulnerability is disclosure, where she says like vulnerability is not the same thing as oversharing. And I think our episode last week with Melissa Jerkways gets into some really great examples of this with like boundaried vulnerability.
Boundaried vulnerability.
So definitely listen to that if you have not heard that interview yet. But Brené gives some examples of something a leader might say during times of uncertainty. So things like being honest about the struggle, naming some of the unsaid emotions in the room, creating a safe container by asking the team to write down what they need to feel open and safe in the conversation. So you're finding ways to create that vulnerability. You're acknowledging the feelings that exist and even acknowledging like some of your own feelings without dumping on other people. So like remembering like vulnerability is not the same as oversharing, I think is a key.
We have to remember your position too.
Yes.
You can tell your team, hey, I'm actually having a real hard week at home. I might not be my best and I apologize for that. But telling them why or like dumping your emotions and your stress from your home life to someone that especially reports to you is generally not going to work because they're going to perceive you have to, that's the perspective taking part. How would you feel if your boss just came in and started telling you all his life's problems and my wife is leaving and my dog? No, not good. Not good.
Yeah. And like even when the thing you're talking about is work related, there's a difference between boundaried vulnerability and coming in and just making statements that are actually seeking sympathy from the people in your team. She gave an example of like, I'm really falling apart too. I'm not the enemy here. Like that is not what you want to say, right? Because there's a certain degree of self-management as a leader. But you can be honest. You can say like, this conversation is incredibly difficult for me, but your feelings are not the focus. I think ultimately is one of the differences. She also notes fake vulnerability, which is where a leader says things like they can ask questions, but then they don't actually take the time and go through the work to create the psychological safety or really allow anybody to speak up at all. So that's the classic, like, oh yeah, let's have psychological safety, but like people don't actually feel safe. And that actually, it's not just ineffective, but it actually breeds distrust. And we've talked about boundaries a good deal on our podcast, but basically she defines it very simply.
Yeah, I thought the way she described it was just so clear. You can have a discussion with someone and say, hey, I know we're having a hard discussion. Being angry, that's okay. Yelling, not okay.
Yep.
And it's just so like, here's some boundaries. They're cut and dried.
Yep. That's making clear what's okay, what's not okay, and why.
And why.
Yeah.
And why.
So like very simple.
Yeah.
Vulnerability minus boundaries is not vulnerability.
Fair.
I like that. She also kind of warns of these things that can exist beneath the surface for us. And like a lot of this really just comes back to when we talk about self-awareness and how you can build that. But the self-intention is like a self-protection need that lurks beneath the surface. And it often drives behavior that's actually outside of our core values because it's trying to protect us. And then a stealth expectation is a desire expectation that exists outside of our awareness. These are like below the surface, right? So if you take the iceberg model, this is the stuff that's like way below the water level that you don't necessarily see on the outside. But this is this desire expectation that typically includes a dangerous combination of fear and magical thinking. The guide that she gives, don't share without understanding your role. Who are you talking to? What is your role in context to them? Recognizing what your professional boundaries are and getting clear on what your intentions and expectations are, especially if there's any of those stealth ones that can be lurking below the surface. So asking yourself, why am I telling this person this? Am I trying to make myself feel better? Or is this actually about the other person? And I think that's a great guideline. All right. So then moving into section 2, the call to courage, which oh my God, I related so hard to Brené in this chapter in general. But she gives this kind of opening story where first she gets confronted by her team, and then she also starts getting confronted by her husband as well for her poor ability to estimate time and how long things will take to complete, which my ADHD time blindness is real. So Mike is just sitting over there, making a lot of sounds. Yes. And then she goes home to do some research on project management as a way to help improve her project timelines. And she decides she's going to get a 6 Sigma black belt, which the next day she realizes is not a good idea, but that is very much something I would do. But she ends up tying a lot of that back to feeling fear, scarcity, and anxiety.
She did some hard self-introspection. Her team confronted her and they're like, Brené, we need to rumble with you. Okay, that's a little dorky, but
yeah.
Fine. Who am I? 6 best New York Times. Okay, so fine. And they're like, you're driving us crazy and you're creating a lot of anxiety. And I love this story where they're about to have a dinner party, or it's a pub crawl, and she wants her husband to go to Home Depot and get flowers for the lawn, and you're gonna paint, and we have 2 hours, and his face is melting off. I identify with this a little bit too. I don't know why, but yes, some people do not perceive time the same as the rest of us perceive time. And
hey, I know it about myself now.
Yeah, it's fair. I'm still salty that you blamed me for missing the flight to your bachelorette party.
I didn't exactly blame you.
I'm chronically early.
Yeah.
I'm and you were a musician too. So I don't know how, and I know you were successful at, you can't be late. You're not.
And I wouldn't be for music stuff, but it requires so much from me to plan enough time. I would just have to get there insanely early.
Well, now you have an app on your computer that when you have an appointment, it completely takes over your computer.
Yes.
So that you can't keep snoozing the alarm.
It's been the best thing. In the world, the app, if there's any other ADHDers here that have the problem of getting into hyperfocus and forgetting about your calls, this app I think is called In Your Face, which is
that's genius.
A great name. Yeah, it literally takes over your whole screen, so I cannot miss my meetings. It's beautiful. Yeah. Anyway, though.
Anywho.
So a lot of what she says in this chapter is around clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So being clear with people in general is super important. And I really liked this Joseph Campbell quote she talks about where the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. So when you're afraid to get into something, it probably means you need to get into it.
Yeah, she uses the Star Wars example from Empire Strikes Back. And I actually remember, I still don't feel they did that scene very well in terms of displaying the meaning of what they wanted to convey. But it's a real good quote.
It is great. Yeah. And she says that everybody, when she's talking about team dynamics, it's a really important for everybody to take the roles of both being an optimist, which is doing the dreaming, and a realist, which is reality checking the dreams with facts. I definitely have a lot of strong opinions about how both of these activities are very important, and that they're different types of thinking and they have to be separated. But
she quotes from Good to Great, who uses the Stockdale paradox. Admiral Stockdale was captured in the early years of Vietnam, and he was held as a prisoner of war for 8 years, tortured many times, but he took it as his mission to keep everybody's spirits up and try and get as many people home as possible. And after he got 8 years is a long time to be in a POW camp in probably the jungles of Vietnam. I don't think I'd make that. But they asked him, like, who didn't make it? And he said the optimists, the people that were like, oh, we're going to be home by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and go, and it would come and go again. And they died of broken hearts. But they just gave up. So he said, you had to have faith in the ultimate success of your goal. And like, we're absolutely going to make it, but not fail to confront the reality of the situation in which you found yourself. So Stockdale paradox, I think, is used in business a lot, and it's pretty pertinent.
Yeah.
You know? Like the economy can be down, and that may be something you have to confront, and you can't ignore that. You can't ignore the reality of the conflict or battle that you find yourself in, but you have to believe in your ultimate victory.
And then the rest of this section is really getting into the people on your team have fears and feelings, right? Because we're all human. Like, how do you as a leader deal with that? And she says leaders must either invest a reasonable amount of time attending to fears and feelings, or squander an unreasonable amount of time trying to manage ineffective and unproductive behavior, which means if you're not holding space for those feelings and fears up front, it's going to come out in a lot of behaviors that are not desirable. And it's going to take a lot of your time to manage those behaviors.
Yeah, I feel that real hard. People are not machines. You, as a leader, you need people to perform complex duties and help you achieve a mission, a goal. But if you don't recognize them as thinking, feeling complex beings and treat them accordingly, you are going to manage their unproductive behaviors. So, choose your hard, I guess.
Yeah. And she also notes, I think, another important thing to say, allowing space to talk about feelings does not mean that you as a leader are responsible for the emotions of others. And you can still set boundaries. Yeah, that's around that.
She talks about that in the empathy section later. Identifying with the emotion is empathy.
Yeah.
You know,
it doesn't mean you are taking ownership of it.
Yeah. Or letting it necessarily. I had a kind of a little epiphany when she described empathy versus sympathy. Sympathy, you have in music, you have sympathetic vibration. So if you play something loud enough next to a timpani, it will start to vibrate. And it's vibrating in its own pitch, and it's creating a wave action between two things. That's not the same as empathy, which is I identify with the pitch that you are singing at this moment.
Yeah. Well, sympathy is like a disconnection, like, right? Like,
yeah.
I forget where she says this, but it's I feel sorry for you versus I feel
sorry with you.
With you.
Yeah.
I feel with you. Yeah. So I think that's, it's funny that we refer to, like, there's a genre of sympathy cards and sympathy flowers when somebody dies, right? But there is almost like there's like a removal.
I'm sure there's process. A lot of doctoral theses on the difference between these two. And
I'm sure.
So there should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just under half of the leaders we interviewed initially talked about courage as a personality trait and not as a skill. It is, in fact, a skill that can be taught, is a painful process. Courage is something I've seen in jiu-jitsu. I've seen many unathletic, nerdy, uber nerds go from scared and hesitant to absolutely just beasts on the mat. And if you saw them outside, you would think this is the most like hipster, nerdy guy possible. He's got a mustache, but on the mats, he's absolutely fearless. And you develop that confidence through repetition and through time, through, as Brené says, rising so many times, losing so many times, and gaining skill and confidence over the years. There's no substitute for that, but it is absolutely a learned skill.
Yeah.
Section 3, the armory.
Yeah. So section 3 has a lot of meaty stuff in it. So she starts off talking about what the meaning of wholeheartedness is, which is engaging in our lives from a place of worthiness. So integrating our thinking, feelings, and behaviors, and knowing no matter what that I am enough. And so many organizational cultures and leaders think that if we sever the heart, like the vulnerability and emotions, we'll be more productive, efficient, and easier to manage. But when you imprison the heart, she says, you also kill courage.
Yeah, she talks about integrity. The root of the word integral is integralis, which is making up a whole, from an older Latin integer, as my fellow math nerds may know, untouched and entire. In the modern usage, we say integrity as kind of like honesty, but it's a lot more than that. It's an integration of all the parts of you.
She talks about like when we get disembodied from our emotions to the point that we don't recognize what physical feelings are connected to which emotional feelings we feel. We don't gain control, we lose it, which is, I think, also a theme in next week's episode. But the body is really where our feelings live, right? Mm-hmm. And if you don't understand, which I certainly didn't before I started doing this kind of work, is what feelings are you feeling in your body when you feel a certain way? And if you're not connected to that, then you're not going to have control or self-regulation.
Yeah, there's a much more somatic work being done now. I haven't read the book, but the book, The Body Keeps the Score, or something like that. It's really true. If you don't address the feelings that you have, they will stay in your body. They will live there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's not touchy-feely. That's not woo. That's not Jesus. Here's somebody that expresses her emotions as they come up.
Oh my God. Jesus, can you just not mess with the podcasting equipment?
She's so pretty. Look at her.
Oh.
She's so perfect.
She's very active this morning. Okay.
So shame is the feeling that washes over us and makes us feel so flawed that we question whether we're worthy of love, belonging, and connection.
Yeah.
And the resultant is putting on your armor.
Yeah. And shame, she gets more into shame in the next section after this. It's so powerful. But yeah, that is one of the reasons why we reach for our armor, right? And then I love that she gives these 16 examples of what does it look like to be an armored leader versus what does it look like to be a daring leader. So kind of like going through these, the armored leadership, driving perfectionism and fostering fear of failure versus modeling and encouraging healthy striving, empathy, and self-compassion. So like that, and I think it's actually really interesting. Like she defines perfectionism as a self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels the thought that if I look perfect, if I do everything perfectly, I can minimize my painful feelings of blame, judgment, and shame.
No comment.
We relate to this.
Yeah, it's really deep. Like I was a perfectionist as a musician, and if I made a mistake, even in practice, I was so hard on myself and I would get so frustrated.
Oh my God.
And I fought that the whole time. Even in the beginning in jiu-jitsu, it's like, why am I not good at this? You just started, sir. And it takes years to get good. I don't care. I should be. No, that's not. That's not actually how these things work. So I think we're hopefully teaching our children nowadays a healthier approach to achievement and progress.
Yep. And the daring leadership counterpoint of this is healthy striving. And the difference between that and perfectionism is that it's self-focused. So you're comparing with yourself, right? You're like, how can I improve? Versus perfectionism is focused on other people, and it's more like, what will other people think? And then the next one is working from scarcity and squandering opportunities for joy and recognition versus practicing gratitude and celebrating milestones and victories, which also I really felt. But she said there's two reasons why leaders often don't really celebrate enough and don't give enough like recognition. Like one is like this, when's the other shoe going to drop feeling, where you're like, if we celebrate this, then something's going to go wrong. We're like inviting something to go wrong, which is a very real fear. And then the other one is, oh, if we celebrate, we don't want our employees to get too excited because there's so much work still to do.
Yeah, I read a book by Tim Grover. He was Michael Jordan's trainer, and he classified 3 different levels of achievers. And at Jordan's level, you maybe celebrate, okay, I want a title. Okay, you're happy for about 15 minutes. And then you're on to the next thing. And while that may be, I don't know, Michael Jordan, he might be very happy. But generally, that level of person is not happy unless they're actively winning and then immediately going back to, well, I got to do it again. And I think that can be hard. What happens when the thing that you were achieving goes away? You guess you have to find something else, being able to be happy with long-term progressive growth as a person rather than achieving external things is something we should be talking about and don't really talk about.
Yeah. Totally.
And I did the same thing. I would win, and then I'm like, okay, back to the practice room. I would have an amazing concert, and then 10:30 at night, I would go home and start practicing. It was like, okay, maybe I can. We launched a podcast. We didn't celebrate. We just
oh my God, yeah.
We've still barely done anything. And so what are we doing next? Okay, all right.
Yeah, no, this is something we actively try to have a practice of ending every day by talking about our wins.
Yes,
gratitude and our intentions for the next day. We try to hold each other accountable for it. We are far from perfect at it, but
we're doing better. We're trending upwards.
Yeah, and that's recognizing that is not our natural tendency, but it's so valuable.
No, it's not.
Yes. Yeah. And then the next one is numbing versus setting boundaries and finding real comfort. And this is really the difference between numbing is really like you're avoiding the feelings and you're just going to take the edge off with whatever provides the quickest relief, whether that's substances or food or like whatever it is, right?
Shopping, anything. Can be anything.
Yeah. Versus finding real comfort, like the cure for that is developing tools and practices that allow you to lean into the discomfort, like actually feel your feelings and then renew your spirit. So what is bringing actual comfort? Which is very individual, but maybe it's like journaling out your feelings or just doing some breathing exercises or going to a yoga class, taking a walk, like whatever it is, finding out the difference between numbing behaviors and behaviors that are actually going to help you feel your feelings and then process them and move on. Which, oh my gosh, is that an ongoing thing to work on? The next one is propagating the false dichotomy of victim or Viking, crush or be crushed, which is like this win-lose, zero-sum power dynamic, and instead practicing integration with a strong back, soft front, wild heart. With strong back being grounded confidence and boundaries, soft front staying vulnerable and curious, and wild heart living out these paradoxes and not giving in to the either or BS that reduces us, he says.
Yeah, I'll bring back like extreme ownership and Jocko. It's all being comfortable with the dichotomies of leadership and being comfortable in that chaotic environment somewhere in between them.
Yep.
And being able to exist, or as Brené would say, rumble in that space. That's hard. I don't know if we're wired to look for binaries, good, bad, us, them, right, wrong, but getting to the truth, we may be.
I think it's a cognitive bias, actually. I don't remember the name of it.
Yeah. Being okay with the ambiguity and the chaos has been a struggle for me, for sure. I like things in order. I like things in chronological order, color order, size order. Life is not like that. at all.
And the next one is being a knower and being right versus being a learner and getting it right. Which, yeah. And
no comment.
I think this kind of goes back to like when we talked about imposter syndrome, right? Like the 5 types of imposters.
Yeah.
One of them was like that knowledge one where you feel like you have to know everything, right? She says for many people, that comes from shame and trauma, right?
Yeah.
So recognizing that is important. But for learning the 3 strategies she gives is like name the issue that's at hand, make learning and curiosity skills a priority, and acknowledge and reward great questions that are like that. I don't know, but I want to find out, instead of being like, oh my God, I don't know this. What's wrong with me? Which I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And then hiding behind cynicism versus modeling clarity, kindness, and hope. And this is an interesting one because I think we both have fairly sarcastic senses of humor.
Oh, I also wrote this down. The root of the word is Sarkasian, which means to tear flesh like dogs.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So that is sarcasm, right? It's like tearing I've worked to make myself less sarcastic because it's fun to be funny once in a while, but it's also, I recognize that as like a defense mechanism to places that I feel vulnerable, unworthy, uncertain, not sure if I'm up to the task, or don't know how to deal with a situation.
Yeah.
Cynicism, I don't know. I still identify as a curmudgeonly New Yorker, but those aren't super healthy leadership traits to model. It's good to keep people's sense of humor, but not to deflect problems with these sarcasm. Yeah, it's very dramatic.
Well, yeah, and she says that, cynicism and sarcasm are often masking anger, fear, and feelings of inadequacy.
I said that, so I can have 6 New York Times bestsellers.
Yeah,
cool.
That's basically
just as easy, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's sarcastic.
Yeah.
Or cynical. Say, my feelings of inadequacy.
Whereas like the antidote to sarcasm and cynicism is stay clear and kind, practice the courage to say what you mean and mean what you say, and cultivate hope when the cynicism is coming from a place of despair. I mean, easier said than done, but...
Oh, it's so hard. But I think the naming
valuable.
It is super powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she talks about that like in meetings too. Like, it seems very tense in here. Okay, if you say that out loud as a leader, people will relax just a little bit because they'll notice it's not hidden anymore. At least bring it into the sunlight.
Yeah. And then using criticism as self-protection versus making contributions and taking risk. And I think a lot of this is kind of like yes and from improv, right? Where it's important for everybody to make a contribution. She talks about like criticism is often from fear and unworthiness. And there's these 2 different. The nostalgia criticism is like the knee-jerk, that's just how we do it here reaction. And then there's also the invisible army, where instead of saying how we feel about something, it's we don't want to change course. So you're like pretending like you're representing a group instead of saying, this is how I feel.
The royal we.
The royal we. Yeah. I was like, oh God, I've been in a lot of meetings where that's been used for sure. But her company has a rule where you aren't allowed to criticize without offering a point of view in return. I think that's
awesome.
Really good. Yeah. It's like that, because the people who are just naysayers who just want to tear everything down but don't actually have any solutions is not a productive form of communication. And then using power over versus using power with, power to, and power within. So, and she says like hierarchy works except for when people in leadership positions hold their power over others, which is when their decisions benefit the minority, the people at the top, and oppress the majority. So common. But the other side of that is power with is finding common ground among different interests so that we build collective strength. Power to is giving everybody on your team agency, empowering them and acknowledging their unique potential. And power within is the ability to recognize differences and respect others, which is really grounded in self-worth and self-knowledge.
Such a huge topic, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of reference MBS, Michael Bungay-Stenya. He says, and I identify with this too, as being a white man, we got dealt a lot of cards. So his approach and mine, that I try and give power away whenever possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but your perspective and your experience may be different. And Brené says the same thing too, being part of majority culture, right? In America, white, straight, Christian. She had to overcome some gender biases, of course, but she still got dealt a better hand than a lot of people as far as being part of that majority. As a leader, you have to be super conscious of how you're using your power, which is often tacit, that you don't realize that other people perceive how they perceive you. And you're always on stage.
Yep.
And, what may seem like a passing moment to you may live in somebody on your team. It may live in their brain all day or all week. So you have to be super conscious of how you're wielding this power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that could just be a whole coaching session, right? How are you wielding power over people versus how can you more consciously use power with, power to, and power within? It's so good. Hustling for your worth versus knowing your value. Oh my God. Some of these I'm like, did you write this for me?
Yeah.
But
stop talking about me, Brené.
But yeah, she talks about as a leader, you should not be encouraging your people to just hustle for the sake of hustling, because people hustle when they don't understand their value for the organization, and rather getting clear on the leader's value and the team members' values will create lanes, and we stop hustling for worthiness and we start leaning into our gifts.
Yeah, knowing your value, takes a long time.
It does. Yeah, and then the next one is leading for compliance and control versus cultivating commitment and shared purpose. And this is true leadership, right? Versus the former is really about fear and power. So you're trying to get people to get the task exactly right instead of actually using creative problem solving. And people tend to hold on to their power and only push responsibility down. So then people are asked to do things that they don't actually have the authority to accomplish, and then they ultimately fail. Seen that before?
Yeah, and this is the part I played for my team, and I love the example that she uses of paint done. What does done look like? And she goes through a really interesting example where she has some expectations for the team that aren't verbalized, that they don't understand, and they're doing what she asked them to do, but she gets very frustrated. And how are they supposed to know what was deep? And I had a moment of revelation that I expect people, or I not expect, but I think they can read my mind.
Yeah.
And I think they can see from my perspective and my experiences. I'm like, I can see it. Why can't you? Okay, you're not in my brain. So
as your wife, I can agree.
So the paint done thing, and when she does this, she explains the finished vision, not just in terms of a task completion list, but what her overarching vision is for the end of the situation. And as soon as she does that, her team is not only able to help her better, but also to look for the holes in her thinking or the things that aren't going to work based on knowledge that they have that maybe she didn't. So I'm actually learning to paint right now, so I love the paint done. So we've adopted that. We've adopted that nomenclature, and I think it's awesome because you get people that see their role in the overall mission and their value to the mission rather than just getting a checklist done, which is what she means by compliance. She doesn't mean regulatory compliance. She means I'm just doing this because you told me to do it. I don't understand the big picture at all.
Yeah.
And going back to Jocko, knowing the why. But she actually explains the process in very vivid detail.
Yeah, for sure. And then weaponizing fear and uncertainty versus acknowledging, naming, and normalizing collective fear and uncertainty, which is so interesting, right? Because I think there's history really shows all these examples of keeping people afraid and giving them a common enemy. But that is not actually an effective human-led approach to leadership versus, and I love this quote, leadership has a responsibility to acknowledge the tumult, but not fan it, to share information and not inflate it or fake it without feeling divisiveness or benefiting from it. That is like acknowledging the underlying fears and uncertainties, acknowledging the elephant in the room, right? But you're not adding to it. You're like giving space for it without like fanning the flame. I love that image.
Yeah, Megan talks about this, and we're doing an episode on wellness in the workplace, especially in this time of uncertainty in the political landscape and the elections coming up. The weaponization of fear is again, like some of the fundamentals of the art of war, and there's in ancient Chinese texts, there's like the 5 fears and how to use them in warfare. And there's an undercurrent of fear in our society. We don't talk about it. And it leaves us open to psychological manipulation. Let me name that very clearly. Yeah.
Yep. And then this next one, I think, kind of goes hand in hand with companies that really like value hustling and see that as a good thing. But this rewarding exhaustion as a status symbol and attaching productivity to self-worth versus modeling and supporting rest, play, and recovery. Which, oh my God, I think this is the companies attaching productivity to self-worth. For one thing, many people, us included, naturally tend to think that our worthiness is tied to our productivity, right? And when that is true, doing anything that doesn't add to the bottom line is going to provoke stress and anxiety. But like I worked for a company where I was starting a new job. I had told them about a vacation that was already booked before I started. And then 2 months after I started, we were coming up on the vacation and I was planning for it. And they're like, "You're not really going to go on that vacation, are you? Like, could you like just cancel that?" And good for me, I said no, but I went on my vacation because I thought that was ridiculous. But I'm like, this whole idea of, oh no, we need you here. You need to keep working. Oh my God, it's so unhealthy, right? It's like such this like unproductive, like hustle culture.
Yeah, I wrote looks around uncomfortably.
Yeah. It's like modeling and supporting rest, play, and recovery, which is so hard. I think we could almost do an episode just on...
We could do like a series
just on this.
You could do a whole podcast on it, actually.
Yeah, but I love she does give a shout out for play here, which as an improviser, I always appreciate. That play shapes our brain, fosters empathy, helps us navigate complex social groups, and is at the core of creativity and innovation. So, hey. So last few of these, I know there's a lot of these, but I did want to go through them because I feel like they're so good.
When there's only 16 of them, I'm like, okay. The brain actually can't remember. It doesn't keep that many things.
Oh, it's so many. Yeah.
It's too many to keep in working memory. But
I love that it's actually breaking down to specific behaviors.
Yeah, naming them and naming the armored behavior and the open behavior, if you will, the unarmored behavior of daring leaders.
Yeah. Well, and like all of these on the armored leadership, I'm like, I've worked for this company. They're very relatable. So tolerating discrimination, echo chambers, and a fitting in culture versus cultivating a culture of belonging, inclusivity, and diverse perspectives. She says, only when diverse perspectives are included, respected, and valued can we start to get a full picture of the world. And this requires the courage to acknowledge our own privilege and staying open to learning about our biases and blind spots.
Yeah, I used to have a real bias against the word bias because it implies, I'm from the 80s, like almost like a racism, right? And I'm not biased, but in fact, bias is literally a slant in definition. So it's the way of seeing something that's honestly just slanted from your own perspective.
Well, it's actually like it's shortcuts that your brain...
Yeah, we use
these... They're heuristics. They're mental shortcuts that your brain uses to help make the tens of thousands of decisions that it has to make every day.
Yeah.
When we're not operating at our like conscious thinking.
So that's like system 1 and system 2 thinking.
That's exactly what
that's
I'm pulling
exactly
from.
what it is,
yeah.
right? Oh, Bezos.
Which we've talked about before.
No. Bezos, no.
Bezos does not want to let us finish getting through the 16 behaviors. Yeah. So the general conversation about diversity and inclusion and belonging and all of that, I think that is very much deserves its own episode or series. So I don't want to get too much into that here, but I think this is absolutely true. There's a really good take on it in Melissa Jerkois's interview last week as well about diversity in thinking specifically and why it's so important. But we will absolutely get more into this as well, because I think there's a lot of what she says is that so many people think that it's better to not talk about it, and actually being able to not talk about things is from a place of privilege.
Yeah.
You only have the power to not talk about it if you're coming from from a place of privilege.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm been very aware of recently.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk more on this.
Yeah, if you're African American or you're not anything that's not part of a majority culture, it's probably not in your ability to not face these issues because they're forced upon you. And as someone from the majority culture, I can just be like, I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
I don't want to discuss that. That makes me uncomfortable. Well, everybody else has to deal with that. So saying no to dealing with it, that's the literal definition of privilege.
She gets into this a little more towards the end of the book, but yeah, it's like part of all of this, right, is not staying silent. Like, you need to listen and try to understand and try to facilitate discussion, and also know that like you're going to make mistakes.
You're going to make a lot of mistakes.
Messy,
yeah, it's going to be messy.
But you can't just not say anything at all, or you're just acting on your privilege, basically. So
that is not courageous leadership.
Yes. So last few of these, collecting gold stars versus giving gold stars. This is another one, right? Because we get promoted into leadership based on what we've done by ourselves, right, as individual contributors. But once you're in a leadership role, you need to be thinking about how you're rewarding others instead of just seeking to be rewarded on your own, which is very difficult on the ego.
Well, it can be, this is, you wrote down, right? Like, what got us promoted in the first place can get in the way of good leadership, because again, you have to see where you rank on the privilege scale too. It's probably different for me than it is for somebody else, but we crave that recognition. Mm-hmm. We crave that acceptance and that safety. If my boss sees that I'm doing well, I do that. Oh my God, I do this. My boss sees that I'm doing well.
Good.
I just want to.
I love recognition.
I don't love the recognition. I'm looking for the psychological safety of if I don't do really well, I could potentially lose my livelihood and I catastrophize. So I'm going to be unemployed and I can't feed myself. And I go pretty quick to that. So I don't know. It's a work in progress.
Yep. And then zigzagging and avoiding versus talking straight and taking action. So zigzagging, she says, is the energy we spend trying to dodge the bullets of vulnerability, whether it's conflict, discomfort, confrontation, or potential for shame, hurt, or criticism. So I just get this visual of dancing around the real issue. And because you're trying to not have that moment of vulnerability and discomfort versus actually bringing clarity to what you're trying to avoid and then getting clear about what needs to actually be done to step into it. And she does know.
This is squirming.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Squirming.
And she says the running around, like the zigzagging, is a huge energy suck.
Sure it is.
So it could actually, we talk about this in our episode with Megan next week, but the feeling of pain and discomfort is so much worse than just actually sitting and feeling it. And this is the same thing, right? Like you can take so much energy to avoid something, to dance around it and run around it and zigzag it than to actually face it head on. So that's a good thing to remember for my logic brain. And then the last one of these 16 is leading from hurt versus leading from heart. She's just like, many people lead from a place of hurt and smallness, and they use their position of power to try to fill that self-worth gap. But it doesn't work because that's not what they really need. And this quote that you can never get enough of what you don't need. So seeking external validation and the power that comes with leadership to help improve your self-worth is not going to work. Versus actually investing the time in our own fears, feelings, and history so that we're minimizing our own unproductive behaviors and we can actually lead from the heart. I love these. It took us a while to go through all these, but honestly, I think they're so valuable. And yeah, I think lastly, if shame and blame is our management style, or a pervasive cultural norm, we can't ask people to be vulnerable and brave.
I just want to say things about shame and blame, and shaming others and blaming others is definitely coming from a place of fear. It's a fear of our own position's vulnerability. As a leader, it can be hard to rally everyone to accomplish a mission. And when that doesn't happen, you're going to be the one that has to answer for it, because you, as the captain of the boat, are responsible for everything that happens, even though you're not carrying it out. And you have one of two choices in that moment. You can coach and teach and review and go over things, or you can get mad or upset and blame people and shame them for their failures or shortcomings. And that's a very selfish reaction. It's a very self-centered reaction.
Yep. So yeah, I think that's a good stopping point. The next section, she actually gets way more into shame. We will finish out this book, this LBC, in 2 weeks, actually, because as we mentioned, next week we are airing a special episode on how leaders can promote mental health and wellness during the high stress times like this upcoming election. So in 2 weeks, we will air part 2, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
The Love and Leadership podcast is produced and co-hosted by me, Kristen Sharkey, and co-hosted by Mike Sharkey. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. We can't stress enough just how much these reviews help. You can follow us on LinkedIn under Kristen Sharkey and Michael Sharkey, and on Instagram as Love Leader Pod. You can also find more information on our website, loveandleadershippod.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.